Hi, I'm Daniel Ionita, and over a few sessions, we shall see how many, I will help you become familiar with Romanian poetry in English. Who cares about poetry, right? Who cares about Romanian poetry? Well, there is at least two of us. During my work as a poet and translator and student of poetry as well, I found that typically the English language reader, be they from the USA or Canada or Australia, New Zealand, the UK, might be familiar with their own literature to some extent, then perhaps the literature of other English-speaking countries. The best known would still be the US and the UK. Then if they studied perhaps literature at university, or if they are avid readers, they would be familiar with some Caribbean, Indian, South African, colonial literature, if you like. And then a few of them might be familiar with some French, Italian, Spanish, South American, German, and then there'll be a big jump to Russia. Some Russian literature would be known to the English-speaking, English-reading reader. Maybe Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Lermontov or some such, but nothing about the countries in between. Nothing about Hungary or Poland or the Czechs, the Slovaks, Romanian literature, Serbian, Slovenian, Albanian. I bet no one knows about Albanian literature, although they should. The Albanians have an amazing writer, Ismail Kadare, who should have received by now the Nobel Prize for Literature. I hope he does before he dies. But this is not going to be a dissertation here, or a critical analysis. Rather simply an immersion into Romanian poetry. I'll recite some of the best Romanian poems, or at least the ones I like the most. Still, I'll give a bit of context at times, regarding the poet, the poem I'll be reciting, sometimes drawing parallels into the English literature, English language literature, but that will be short. In fact, this introductory piece that you're watching now is going to be the longest speech or prose element, if you like, in the whole of the series. By the way, while the intro and context and poem will be in English, at the end I'll also read the poem in its original form in Romanian, for whoever wants to hear that as well, be that for prosody, to hear how it sounds even though you may not understand it, or if you are bilingual Romanian, then maybe to listen to the poems one after the other to see how they kind of go in terms of the translation, the faithfulness, the imagery, and so on and so forth. How it's been done, whatever. I'll leave 3 or 4 seconds pause between the two versions of the poem so that you can switch off. In fact, you can switch off at any time, even now. Don't do it. For this series, I will use this voluminous volume, so to speak, Testament 400 Years of Romanian Poetry, done by Minerva Publishing in Bucharest in 2019, which I oversaw as editor and principal translator, realized with the help of my colleagues, Professor Daniel Reynaud, Dr.Adriana Paul, Eva Foster, and for previous editions, because there were at least 3 previous editions, much smaller than this, by Rochelle Bews. Now, a special American edition is going to be published soon in the US and Australia, published by the Australian Romanian Academy Publishing House, and will be available on Amazon and other platforms such as that, and I'll let you know in future videos when this will happen. Some of you might be interested. This work, the one I showed you here, is in chronological order, starting from, if you like, the poetry before they were poets, the popular anonymous ballads, and then the first published Romanian poetry in the mid-1600s, the 17th century, and moving on to the contemporary poetic landscape. Don't worry, I shall not follow it chronologically. I will not start 400 years ago and take you through all of it. I'm going to pick and choose. Excuse me. I'm going to pick and choose whatever poems move me, or poem moves me on the day, whatever I feel inspired by. However, I will cover the most beautiful and also the most significant poems in Romanian poetry. Follow the canon, so to speak, to a great extent. Every now and then I'll introduce a curveball, something surprising, something that I think should be presented and maybe has been missed by literary critics or by the public. So let's get into it. I will start today with a poem written by a poet I do not rate very highly. Well, I wouldn't put him in the, because it is a him, in the top 20 or 30 poets, if you push me. Well, I hear you ask, why give us a mediocre poem, Daniel, when you said you are going to give us the most beautiful, the most significant Romanian poetry? Glad you asked. Good question. Because the poem I shall recite today is just phenomenal. The poet has written one single gem, one lonely diamond, or rather, excuse me, or rather, a better analogy might be a striking meteorite through the night sky. He's never done anything like it before or after this poem. We don't know why. Literary critics don't understand why. Maybe he just gotten imbued by the Holy Ghost and penned this, and then that was that. Nothing better, before or after. Fact of the matter is, this poem has been included for decades now in the high school Romanian literature curriculum. It is considered by literary critics and historians to be one of the best Romanian poems ever written, even on par with Romania's national poet, Mihai Eminescu, with some of his best work. By the way, speaking of Eminescu, I'm sure I'll be pilloried by many Romanians for not starting this series with a poem of his. But hey, I enjoy living dangerously and suffering for it. So, I will start with Ștefan Augustin Doinaș. This is the name of the poet, and with his famous, in Romania at least, poem The Silver Fanged Boar. Doinas lived between 1922 and 2002, was a poet, publisher, member of the Romanian Academy. He was imprisoned during the communist period for 1 year between 1956 and 1957. Became a politician himself after the 1989 revolution. Married his sweetheart, the love of his life, prima ballerina Irinel Liciu of the Romanian Opera. And here is something morbid, or maybe very romantic, if you like, depending on your perspective. The day after Doinas died, his wife committed suicide. Well, let's get on with it. And at the risk of spoiling the surprise, this is a poem about a man following his dream obsessively. You know the myth, Icarus, or maybe Captain Ahab of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Doinas finds, I believe, the ideal way to tell this tale in poetry form. He works out the stages of the journey progressively, increasing the drama at every stage. There are at least 3 themes where you see this progression through the poem until it's inevitable climax. You know the ending. There's no surprise there. Still, Doinas tells the tale in such a way that you would want to hear it. Well, let's just hear it. The Silver Fanged Boar by Ștefan Augustin Doinaș. A Levantine prince, quite enamored with hunting, some dark-hearted forests was travelling through, and making his path with great effort and grunting, he said while on bone flute he merrily blew, "Let's hunt through these forests, untrodden and daunting, the Silver Fanged Boar, who's ferocious and wild, who changes his fur every day as he's molting, and changes his hooves and his glass eye reviled." "Oh, master," the servants with trumpets would say, "that bloodthirsty boar does not travel through here. It's better to chase down the antlers to slay, or the red-colored foxes, or the hares that are near." But smiling and certain, the prince passed ahead, and carefully gazing at trees and the hues, he left in his lair the young deer full of dread, or the sparkly-eyed lynx would smile for a ruse. Through beech woods he'd trample old weeds to the ground. "Just look how he turns. We have closed in for good on this silver-fanged boar. Not too far. Hear his sound. Come over. Let's hunt him with arrows of wood." "My lord, it's the stream through the woods, tall and lush," the smart servant said as he laughed with a roar. But the prince turned around and replied only, "Hush." And the water did shine like the fang of a boar. Under elm trees he'd hasten his scattered old train. You see how he's puffing alone and unreal, the silver-fanged boar over meadow and plain. Come over, let's hunt him with arrows of steel. "My lord, it's the grass which with boots we would brush," the bold-looking servant would say like before. But the prince turned around and replied only, "Hush." And the glistening grass seemed like fangs of a boar. And the firs, he would cry, pushing them to the peak, "You see where he's finding his lair and his shire, the boar from old tiles, of whom old people speak. Come over, let's hit him with arrows of fire." "My lord, it's the moonlight which night fears can't quash," the servant said, laughing, despising and sore. But turning around, the prince only said, "Hush." And the moonlight shone bright like the fang of a boar. Alas, and the rays of the pale stars at dusk, as he crouched for a drink, his knees slowly sagged, there charged a huge boar with his piercing sharp tusk, and the prince through the red dust he savagely dragged. What strange-looking beast, so bloodthirsty and vicious, is stopping the hunt of my silver-fanged boar? What black bird is crying in the moonlight, so listless? What wilted old leaf shakes my soul to the core? My master, the boar with the fangs as of silver, that same had you pierced, and with blood you're awash. The dogs chase it now, can't you hear by the river? But turning, the prince whispered quietly, "Hush. You take the old horn and just blow without pause to sound till I'm dead. to the sky clear and prime. Right then, from the ridges, a big moon arose, and the horn made its sound for a very short time. Mistrețul cu colț de argint. Un prinț din Levant, îndrăgind vânătoarea, prin inimă neagră de codru trecea, croindu-și cu greu prin hățișul cărarea, cânta dintr-un flau de os și zicea: veniți să vânăm prin păduri nepătrunse mistrețul cu colț de argint fioros, ce zilnic își schimbă în scorburi ascunse copita și blana și ochiul sticlos. Stăpâne, ziceau servitorii cu goarne, mistrețul acela nu vine pe aici. Mai bine să abatem vânatul cu coarne, ori vulpile roșii, ori iepurii mici. Dar prințul, trecând zâmbitor înainte, privea printre arbori atent la culori, lăsând în culcuș căprioara cu minte, ori lynxul ce râde cu ochi sclipitori. Sub fagi, el dădea buruiana într-o parte. Priviți cum se învârte făcându-ne semn mistrețul cu colț de argint nu departe, veniți să-l lovim cu săgeata de lemn. Stăpâne, e apa, jucând sub copaci, zicea servitorul privindu-l isteț. Dar el răspundea întorcându-se: taci. Și apa clipea ca un colț de mistreț. Sub ulmi, el zorea risipite alaiuri. Priviți cum pufnește și scurmă stighier mistrețul cu colț de argint peste plaiuri. Veniți să-l lovim cu săgeata de fier. Stăpâne, e iarba, foșnind sub copaci, zicea servitorul zâmbind îndrăzneț. Dar el răspundea întorcându-se: taci. Și iarba sclipea ca un colț de mistreț. Sub brazi el striga îndemnându-i spre creste: priviți unde-și află odihnă și loc mistrețul cu colț de argint din poveste. Veniți să-l lovim cu săgeata de foc. Stăpâne, e luna, lucind sub copaci, zicea servitorul râzând cu dispreț. Dar el răspundea întorcându-se: taci. Și luna sclipea ca un colț de mistreț. Dar, vai, sub luceferii palizi ai bolții, cum sta în amurg, la izvor a plecat, veni un mistreț uriaș și cu colții îl trase sălbatic prin colbul roșcat. Ce fiară ciudată mă umple de sânge, oprind vânătoarea mistrețului meu. Ce pasăre neagră stă în lună și plânge, ce vește de frunză mă bate mereu. Stăpâne, mistrețul cu colț ca argintul, chiar el te-a cuprins, grohăind sub copaci. Ascultă cum latră copoi gonindu-l. Dar prințul răspunse întorcându-se: taci. Mai bine ia cornul și sună într-una. Să suni până mor către cerul senin. Atunci a sfinți după creștete luna și cornul suna, însă foarte puțin.